Rebecca Torres was elbow-deep in gun oil when the bell chimed, announcing another customer. She looked up to see a man in his 30s examining her father's vintage rifle collection with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Most customers browse casually, picking up weapons like they were shopping for groceries. But this man moved differently. His eyes tracked along the barrel of a 1943 Springfield with the reverence of someone who understood its history. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of Torres Gun Services, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench where Rebecca had spent the better part of 3 years since inheriting the business. Her father's tools were arranged exactly as he'd left them, precision instruments that had serviced everything from hunting rifles to military-grade weapons. She'd learned to use each one with the same meticulous care he demanded, though she'd never understood why he insisted on such perfection for something she'd never planned to use herself. When the stranger approached her counter, Rebecca noticed the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, movements economical, eyes constantly scanning. He placed a custom .338 Lapua Magnum on her counter with the careful reverence of someone handling a priceless artifact. Rebecca's breath caught. This wasn't just any rifle. The stock had been modified with a custom cheek rest. The barrel was clearly hand-lapped, and the scope mounted on top cost more than most people's cars. A faded unit patch on his worn leather jacket caught her eye. She couldn't make out the details, but the eagle and trident told her everything she needed to know. David Williams, he introduced himself simply, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a statue. Former military. Heard you do the best cleaning work in 3 states. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the handshake. Rebecca Torres. And whoever told you, that was probably exaggerating. She gestured around the cramped shop where rifles hung from every available wall space, and her workbench overflowed with partially disassembled weapons. This place isn't exactly what you'd call professional. David's eyes swept the shop again. But this time, Rebecca realized he wasn't just looking, he was evaluating. His gaze lingered on her father's collection of precision tools, the way she'd organized different caliber ammunition, the careful labeling system she'd developed for tracking each weapon's service history. Professional isn't about appearances, he said quietly. It's about precision. And from what I can see, you understand precision. As Rebecca began her initial inspection of his rifle, she felt David watching her every movement. She developed her own ritual over the years. First, a visual examination of the entire weapon, checking for obvious wear or damage. Then, careful disassembly, each component placed in a specific order on her cleaning mat. Her father had drilled this process into her during the few years she'd worked alongside him before his death, though back then she'd been more interested in the business side than the technical aspects. You handle that like you've been shooting for decades, David observed, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've never fired a single shot in my life. She continued working, removing the bolt with practiced efficiency. My dad always said he'd teach me when I was ready, but ... She shrugged, not finishing the sentence. Some conversations were too heavy for a first meeting with a stranger. David leaned against the counter, studying her with renewed interest. Never? Not even as a kid? Not even once. Rebecca held up the bolt, examining it under her magnifying lamp. Dad was very particular about safety. Said shooting was something you learned properly or not at all. He was planning to start teaching me the summer I turned 17, but he died in a car accident that spring. The shop fell silent, except for the soft sounds of Rebecca's work. She'd become comfortable with these silences over the years. Customers often shared more than they intended when they brought in weapons that held personal significance. David's Rifle clearly fell into that category. The wear patterns told a story of extensive use, but the meticulous maintenance spoke of someone who treated the weapon as more than just a tool. "This is beautiful work," Rebecca said, running her finger along the custom trigger assembly. Whoever did these modifications knew what they were doing. The trigger pull has to be perfectly consistent at this level. David straightened slightly. "You can tell that just from looking?" "The wear patterns, the way the components fit together. My dad taught me to read weapons like books. Every scratch, every bit of wear tells you something about how it's been used and maintained." Rebecca continued her disassembly, noting the pristine condition of the barrel despite obvious heavy use. "This rifle has seen serious action, but it's been cared for by someone who understands its capabilities." "And what capabilities would those be?" Rebecca paused, realizing she was about to venture into territory she'd only read about in her father's technical manuals. Long-range precision. Work. The barrel length, the caliber, the scope mounting system. This is built for extreme distance shooting. Probably effective out to, she calculated quickly, considering the ballistic characteristics of the .338 Lapua cartridge. Maybe 1,500 meters in the right hands. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What? If I told you the right hands could push it considerably further than that?" Something in his tone made Rebecca look up from her work. David was watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how isolated her shop was, how few people knew she was here alone most days. But instead of feeling threatened, she found herself curious. There was a challenge in his voice, a suggestion of possibilities she'd never considered. "I'd say that would depend entirely on the shooter," she replied carefully, returning to her work but keeping David in her peripheral vision. David smiled for the first time since entering her shop, and Rebecca realized that somehow, without meaning, too, she'd just passed some kind of test. David returned exactly 3 days later, but his rifle wasn't with him. Rebecca noticed immediately the careful way he entered, the deliberate pause as he surveyed the shop, the manila folder tucked under his arm. This wasn't a customer visit. This was something else entirely. "Your rifle's ready," Rebecca called from behind the counter, where she'd been organizing her father's old ballistics charts, cleaned and calibrated. Though I have to say, it barely needed any work. Whoever maintains that weapon knows what they're doing. "That would be me," David replied, but he made no move toward the counter. Instead, he wandered over to a display case containing her father's personal collection rifles that had never been for sale, each one representing a different era of precision shooting. "Tell me about your father." The question caught Rebecca off guard. In 3 years of running the shop, customers rarely asked about her personal life. They wanted their weapons serviced quickly and professionally, nothing more. "What do you want to know?" David stopped in front of a 1960s Remington 700 that her father had customized for long-range competition. "I did some research after our conversation. Eduardo Torres trained military snipers for 15 years before opening this shop. 3-time national precision shooting champion. Developed the Torres method for extreme long-range ballistic calculation." Rebecca's hand stilled on the charts. Few people knew about her father's military background, and even fewer understood the significance of his contributions to precision shooting. "You've done your homework." "I'm curious about something," David continued, turning to face her directly. "A man who dedicated his life to precision shooting, who trained some of the best marksmen in the military, never taught his own daughter to fire a weapon." The question stung because Rebecca had asked herself the same thing countless times. He was protective. Said shooting wasn't a game, that it required maturity and respect. He wanted to wait until I was old enough to understand the responsibility. David nodded slowly, then opened the manila folder he'd been carrying. I've been thinking about our conversation, about precision, about natural ability, about the difference between technical knowledge and practical application. He pulled out a photograph and placed it on the counter. Rebecca leaned forward to examine it. The image showed a desert landscape with two small figures in the foreground and what appeared to be a target in the far distance. Numbers were written in the margin: 3,871 meters, 2.4 miles. Confirmed kill. That's the current world record for longest confirmed sniper shot, David said quietly. Canadian Special Forces 2017. The bullet traveled for over 10 seconds before impact. Rebecca studied the photograph, her mind automatically calculating the variables involved: wind speed, atmospheric pressure, the Coriolis effect, bullet drop. Over that distance, the mathematics were staggering. The precision required for something like this ... double quote she began, is beyond what most people can comprehend, David finished. The shooter had to account for the Earth's rotation, temperature variations along the bullet's path, humidity changes, wind patterns at multiple altitudes. It's not just shooting, it's applied physics at the highest level. Why are you showing me this? David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Because I think you could break that record. Rebecca stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? I've been thinking about it for 3 days. Your technical knowledge, the way you handle weapons, your understanding of ballistics. Theory, most importantly, the way you approach problems. David gestured toward her workbench where she'd organized tools and components with mathematical precision. You have something most shooters never develop: an intuitive understanding of the mechanical relationships involved. David, I told you, I don't shoot. I've never even held a loaded weapon. Exactly. His eyes gleamed with something between excitement and certainty. Do you know what the biggest obstacle is for most long-range shooters? Preconceived notions. Bad habits developed over years of conventional shooting. Muscle memory that works against precision at extreme distances. Rebecca felt a flutter of something she couldn't identify. Part fear, part curiosity. You're serious about this? Dead serious. I've trained dozens of military snipers. I've seen natural talent, and I've seen technical expertise. But I've never seen someone who combines theoretical knowledge with completely untrained instincts. David leaned against the counter, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Your father's methods, his understanding of ballistics, you absorbed. All of that without the interference of practical experience. You're like a blank slate with a PhD in physics. This is insane, Rebecca said, but she found herself looking at the photograph again. Even if what you're suggesting were possible, which it isn't, why would you want to help me? David was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Because I spent my entire adult life pursuing perfection, something I'll never truly master. And I think I just met someone who might. The shop fell silent except for the ticking of her father's old clock. Rebecca stared at the photograph, her mind racing through calculations she'd only ever done theoretically. The distance was impossible. The precision required was beyond human capability. And yet, if I were to hypothetically consider this completely, ridiculous idea, she said slowly, where would we even start? David smiled, and Rebecca realized that somehow, without meaning to, she'd just agreed to something that would change her life forever. The Riverside shooting range sat 23 miles outside town, tucked into a valley where the sound of gunfire wouldn't disturb anyone except the occasional deer. Rebecca had driven past it countless times over the years, never imagining she'd one day be walking through its gates with sweaty palms and a racing heart. David had arrived first, his truck already parked near the rangemaster's office, a long rifle case visible in the bed. Second thoughts? David asked as Rebecca approached, noting the way she kept glancing toward the exit. Third and fourth thoughts, Rebecca admitted. This feels like the stupidest thing I've ever agreed to do. David chuckled, shouldering his rifle case. Good. Overconfidence kills more shooters than bad equipment. He led her toward the 100-yard range, where paper targets hung like silent sentinels in the morning mist. We're starting simple today: basic marksmanship, fundamental breathing, trigger control. Nothing fancy. The rifle David had brought was deliberately unremarkable, a standard Remington 700 and .308 Winchester. The kind of weapon thousands of hunters used every season. No custom modifications, no exotic optics, just a reliable scope and a bipod for stability. Rebecca had cleaned dozens of identical rifles, but holding one with the intention of actually firing, it felt completely different. First rule, David said, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor. The weapon is always loaded, even when you know it isn't. Second rule, never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Third rule, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Rebecca nodded, surprised by how natural the rifle felt in her hands. Years of handling weapons for cleaning had given her an unconscious familiarity with their weight and balance. She settled into the shooting position. David demonstrated bipod, legs extended, her body aligned behind the scope. Forget everything you think you know about shooting from movies or television, David instructed. This isn't about being tough or aggressive. It's about becoming perfectly still, perfectly calm. Breathe normally. Let your heart rate settle. Then take a breath. Let half of it out and hold. Rebecca followed his instructions, surprised by how quickly her breathing steadied. Through the scope, the target at 100 yards looked impossibly close and impossibly far at the same time. The crosshairs wavered slightly with each heartbeat, a phenomenon she'd read about but never experienced. Now, squeeze the trigger. Straight back. Don't jerk it. Don't anticipate the shot. Just apply steady pressure until the rifle fires. Rebecca's first shot cracked across the valley like thunder, the recoil pushing against her shoulder with surprising gentleness. Through the scope, she could see a small hole in the white paper, several inches left of the bullseye. Not bad, David said, studying the target through binoculars. Most people miss the paper entirely on their first shot. It's low and left, Rebecca observed, already analyzing the miss. Either I pulled the trigger incorrectly, or the scope needs adjustment. David lowered his binoculars, studying her with renewed interest. What makes you think it's the scope? The way I was holding the rifle felt right. The trigger pull was smooth, but I noticed the crosshairs seemed slightly off-center when I was aiming. Rebecca adjusted her position slightly, settling back into the scope. May I try again? By all means. Rebecca's second shot hit closer to center but still left of the bullseye. Her third shot was even closer. By her fifth shot, she was consistently hitting within the inner rings of the target. David had gone completely silent, watching through his binoculars with growing amazement. This is impossible, he muttered after Rebecca's 10th shot grouped so tightly that the holes were touching. Nobody shoots like this on their first day. But Rebecca was already lost in the mathematics of it all. Each shot provided data-wine direction, bullet drop, the relationship between her breathing and the rifle's stability. She found herself making tiny adjustments instinctively, compensating for variables she'd only read about in her father's manuals. Can we try a longer distance? She asked, surprising herself with the request. David stared at her for a long moment, then walked downrange to examine her target. When he returned, his expression had shifted from amazement to something approaching awe. Rebecca, this grouping ... He shook his head. Experienced shooters would be proud of this. It's not that impressive, Rebecca said, though privately she was thrilled by her performance. The distance is short. There's no wind. Perfect. Lighting conditions. It's basically a controlled laboratory experiment. That's exactly my point, David said, beginning to pack up the rifle. You're approaching this like a scientist, not a shooter. You're analyzing variables instead of fighting them. He paused, studying her face. How do you feel about trying? 200 yards? The longer distance revealed something extraordinary. While most beginning shooters struggled with the increased difficulty, Rebecca seemed to thrive on the additional complexity. She spent several minutes studying the wind flags, calculating bullet drop, adjusting for the slight temperature change as the morning progressed. When she finally took her first shot at the distant target, it struck dead center. Beginner's luck, she said, but her voice carried a note of excitement she couldn't hide. David shook his head slowly. Rebecca, I've trained military snipers who couldn't make that shot on their first attempt at 200 yards. By the end of the session, Rebecca was consistently hitting targets at 300 yards. Her group's tight enough to cover with a quarter. Other shooters at the range had stopped their own practice to watch, drawn by the unusual sight of someone making difficult shots look effortless as they packed up to leave. David turned to Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay, how did that feel? Not the shooting itself, but the process, the calculations, the adjustments, the way everything came together. Rebecca considered the question as she helped load the rifle case into David's truck. The honest answer was that it had felt like coming home, like discovering a language she'd always known but never spoken. The mathematical precision, the way physics and instinct merged into something almost mystical, it was everything she loved. About her father's work, but alive and dynamic instead of theoretical. It felt right, she said finally. Like I was supposed to be doing this. David nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Rebecca, I want you to understand something. What happened today doesn't happen. Natural. Talent exists, but what you just demonstrated goes beyond talent. It's like you were born for this. That night, Rebecca lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with trajectories and wind calculations. She dreamed about shooting before abstract dreams filled with numbers and formulas. But now those dreams had weight and substance. The memory of recoil and the satisfaction of a perfect shot. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd planned to teach her, about the potential he'd seen that she'd never understood. For the first time since his death, Rebecca felt connected to something larger than the quiet routine of her gun shop. Tomorrow, David had promised they would try even longer distances. But what Rebecca didn't know was that David had already made a phone call that night to Colonel Harrison at the Precision Shooting Institute. The conversation had been brief but significant. I found her, David had said simply. The one we've been looking for? Are you certain? She made shots today that I couldn't make consistently, and she's never fired a weapon before in her life. There had been a long pause on the other end. Bring her out to the Institute. Let's see what she can really do. As Rebecca finally drifted off to sleep, she had no idea that her simple agreement to try shooting had already set in motion. Events that would soon consume her entire life. 2 months after that first day at the range, Rebecca's life had become unrecognizable. Her gun shop, once meticulously organized and efficiently run, now showed signs of neglect. Dust gathered on weapons waiting for service, and her appointment book had more cancellations than confirmations. Rebecca barely noticed. Every spare moment was consumed by shooting, studying ballistics, or lying awake calculating wind drift formulas that danced behind her closed eyelids. The transformation had been gradual at first. After that initial session, David had suggested they meet twice a week, then 3 times. Now they were at the range almost daily, pushing distances that made other shooters shake their heads in disbelief. Rebecca had progressed from 300 yards to 500, then 800. Each milestone fell faster than David had thought possible. "This is getting ridiculous," David muttered, studying Rebecca's latest target through high-powered binoculars. At 1,200 yards, she just placed 5 shots in a group smaller than a dinner plate. "I've been shooting for 20 years, and I couldn't make that shot consistently." Rebecca barely heard him. She was already calculating the variables for their next attempt at 1,500 yards, a distance that would require her to account for the Coriolis effect, the Earth's rotation influencing bullet trajectory over the extended flight time. Her notebook, once used for tracking gun shop inventory, now overflowed with atmospheric pressure readings, temperature gradients, and wind speed calculations at various altitudes. "The humidity is dropping," she observed, checking her weather station for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "That'll increase air density at this elevation, which means less bullet drop, but potentially more wind drift if the pressure differential creates thermal currents." David watched her with growing concern. The woman who'd been nervous about firing her first shot had become someone who spoke in ballistic coefficients and atmospheric physics. Her dedication was impressive, but it was also consuming her life in ways that worried him. "Rebecca, when's the last time you took a day off?" "Day off from what?" She was already adjusting her scope for the longer distance, her movements precise and automatic. "This isn't work, David. This is ... She paused, searching for the right word. "This is what I'm supposed to be doing." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when the conditions were all wrong for long-range shooting. A storm system was moving through, bringing gusty winds and intermittent rain that should have made accuracy impossible. Any reasonable shooter would have postponed the session, but Rebecca had insisted on coming to the range anyway. "This is insane," David said, watching wind flags snap and flutter in the chaotic air currents. "We can't shoot in this weather." "Actually, this is perfect," Rebecca replied, setting up her rifle with the calm determination that had become her trademark. "Consistent conditions are easy. Anyone can shoot when everything is stable, but real-world shooting happens in chaos." She'd been studying weather patterns obsessively, learning to read atmospheric disturbances the way her father had read mechanical tolerances. While David saw impossible conditions, Rebecca saw a complex puzzle with solutions hidden in the mathematics of fluid dynamics at 1,800 yards. With wind gusts exceeding 20 miles per hour and visibility reduced by intermittent rain, Rebecca took her time. She spent nearly an hour studying the wind patterns, noting how the storm created predictable cycles of calm and turbulence. When she finally fired, David was certain the shot would miss by yards. The bullet traveled for over 3 seconds through the chaotic air, threading thermal currents and wind shears that Rebecca had somehow calculated with impossible precision. When it struck the target dead center, David went completely silent. "How?" he asked. Finally, Rebecca was already working the bolt for a follow-up shot, her movements smooth and automatic. "The storm creates patterns. Chaos isn't random, it's just complex. You have to think in 3 dimensions, account for how air moves vertically as well as horizontally." Her second shot hit within inches of the first. Her third was even closer. David realized he wasn't just watching exceptional shooting anymore. He was witnessing something that bordered on supernatural. That night, Rebecca didn't go home. She stayed at the range until well past midnight, shooting by the light of powerful spotlights, pushing her limits in conditions that would challenge military snipers. David found her there the next morning, asleep in her truck with ballistic charts spread across the dashboard and her rifle still assembled on the shooting bench. "Rebecca, this has to stop," he said gently, waking her with a cup of coffee from the range office. "You're burning yourself out." She sat up slowly, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in the truck. "What time is it?" 7.m. You've been here for 14 hours. Rebecca looked around, taking in the evidence of her obsession notebooks filled with calculations, empty energy drink cans, targets marked with increasingly distant ranges. For a moment, she seemed to see herself clearly, and David caught a glimpse of concern in her eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted quietly. "The mathematics, the physics, the way everything has to come together perfectly. It's like there's this puzzle in my head that I can't solve, and every shot gets me a little closer to the answer." David understood obsession. He'd seen it in himself and other military snipers who push beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of perfection. But Rebecca's obsession was different. It wasn't about proving herself or overcoming fear. It was about discovering something fundamental about her own capabilities. "What's the longest shot you think you could make?" he asked. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the distant targets that had become as familiar as her own backyard. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I think we're about to find out." That afternoon, they drove to a private facility David knew about, a place where military contractors tested equipment and where the shooting distances stretched beyond anything available to civilians. The rangemaster, a retired Marine named Colonel Harrison, had agreed to let them use the facility after David vouched for Rebecca's abilities. 2 miles, Harrison said, pointing toward a barely visible target in the distance. 3,520 yards. We use it for equipment testing, not actual shooting. The variables at that distance are ... double quotes. He shrugged. "Well, there. Beyond what most people can calculate." Rebecca studied the distant target through her spotting scope, her mind already working through the complex mathematics involved. The bullet would be in flight for over 6 seconds, traveling through multiple atmospheric layers with different wind patterns, temperatures, and air densities. "Can I try?" she asked. Harrison looked at David, who nodded slowly. "She's ready for this." Rebecca's first shot at the extreme distance missed, but not by much. Her second shot was closer. By her 5th attempt, she was consistently hitting within the target area, achieving accuracy at a distance that few shooters in the world had ever attempted. Colonel Harrison watched through high-powered optics, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to something approaching reverence, when Rebecca's final shot of the day struck dead center at 3,520 yards. He lowered his binoculars and stared at her for a long moment. "Miss Torres," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." But what Rebecca didn't know was that Harrison had been evaluating more than just her shooting. He'd been watching her process, her methodology, her unnatural calm under pressure. And he'd already made a decision that would change everything. Colonel Harrison's office felt more like a war room than an administrative space. Maps covered every wall, marked with shooting ranges and ballistic data from decades of military testing. Rebecca sat across from his desk, still processing what had happened at the range. Her shot at 3,520 yards hadn't just hit the target. It had been precise enough to impress a man who'd spent 30 years evaluating the world's best marksmen. "I've made some calls," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. "There are people who need to know about what you can do. But first, I have a proposition." David shifted uncomfortably beside Rebecca. "What kind of proposition?" Harrison pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk. "The International Long-Range Shooting Association is hosting a special event in 6 weeks. They're calling it the Extreme Distance Challenge. 1 shot, 3,800 meters. Official conditions with certified observers." He paused, studying Rebecca's face. "The current world record is 3,871 meters. This would be an attempt to establish a new benchmark for precision shooting." Rebecca felt her heart rate spike. "You're talking about an official record attempt." "I'm talking about making history," Harrison corrected. But there's a catch. His expression grew serious. This isn't just about distance. The ILRSA has specific rules for record attempts. You get 1 day, 3 shots maximum, and if you miss all 3, you're banned from sanctioned competition for life. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Rebecca had been shooting for only 2 months, and now she was being offered a chance to attempt something that seasoned professional spent decades preparing for. "Why me?" she asked. "There are shooters with years more experience, military training, proven track records." Harrison opened the folder, revealing photographs and data sheets from her recent shooting sessions. "Because none of them can do what you just did." "Rebecca, that shot at 3,520 yards. The conditions were far from ideal. Wind was gusting, temperature was fluctuating, and you made it look routine." He leaned forward. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've never seen natural ability like yours," Damon spoke up. "Colonel, with respect, 2 months of training isn't enough preparation for something like this. The pressure alone, which is exactly why it might work," Harrison interrupted. "Most shooters at this level are carrying years of expectations, previous failures, the weight of their reputation. Rebecca doesn't have any of that baggage. She approaches each shot like a physics problem to be solved." Rebecca stared at the photographs of her targets, seeing her progression from that first nervous shot at 100 yards to yesterday's impossible accuracy at over 2 miles. The mathematical part of her mind was already calculating the additional variables involved in extending the distance to 3,800 meters, the increased flight time, the additional atmospheric layers, the compounding effects of minute errors in calculation. "What would the conditions be like?" she asked. Harrison smiled, recognizing the question as acceptance. "The attempt will be made at the Precision Shooting Institute in Nevada. Desert conditions, minimal humidity, but significant temperature. Variations between ground level and altitude. The target will be placed at exactly 3,800 meters, verified by GPS and laser measurement. And the observers? Representatives from the ILRSA, military officials, ballistics, experts. Everything will be recorded and verified according to international standards." Harrison's expression grew more serious. "Rebecca, I need you to understand what you'd be walking into. This isn't just about making a long shot. If you succeed, you'll be the most accurate long-range shooter in recorded history. If you fail, I'll be the woman who thought she could break a world record after 2 months of training." Rebecca finished. The room fell silent. Rebecca could hear the distant sound of gunfire from the ranges outside, other shooters pursuing their own goals with methodical determination. She thought about her father, about the precision he demanded in everything he did, about the potential he'd seen in her that she'd never understood until now. "I need to know something," she said finally. "Do you really think I can do this, or are you just curious to see what happens?" Harrison's answer came without hesitation. "I think you're the most naturally gifted shooter I've ever encountered. But natural talent isn't enough at this level. The pressure will be unlike anything you've experienced: media attention, expert scrutiny, the knowledge that hundreds of people are watching and expecting you to fail. And if I miss, then you miss. But if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Rebecca looked at David, who'd been unusually quiet during the conversation. "What do you think?" David was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions. "I think you're capable of things that shouldn't be possible," he said finally. "But I also think 6 weeks isn't enough time to prepare for something like this. The technical aspects, yes, you've mastered those faster than anyone I've ever seen. But the mental game, the pressure management, then we'll have to work on that too," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Harrison nodded approvingly. I can arrange for additional range time, access to equipment, even some consultation with sports psychologists who work with Olympic athletes. But ultimately, it comes down to you and the rifle. Rebecca thought about her gun shop sitting neglected while she pursued this impossible dream. She thought about the safe, predictable life she'd built for herself, and about the moment David had first challenged her to try shooting. Every decision since then had led to this moment, this choice between safety and the unknown. What do I need to do? Harrison's smile was answer enough. He pulled out a contract and placed it in front of her. Sign this and you're committed. The attempt will be made in 6 weeks, weather permitting. You'll have access to our best equipment, unlimited ammunition for practice, and whatever support you need. Rebecca picked up the pen, then paused. One more question. What's the longest confirmed shot you've ever made? Harrison's expression grew distant. 2,847 meters. Afghanistan, 2009. Took me 3 attempts, and I'd been preparing for that shot for 6 months. Rebecca nodded, then signed her name with the same steady hand that had been making impossible shots for the past 2 months. As she set down the pen, she realized that her life had just changed irrevocably. In 6 weeks, she would either make history or become a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. Either way, there was no turning back now. But what Rebecca didn't realize was that word of her abilities had already begun to spread through military and shooting communities. Phone calls were being made, bets were being placed, and arrangements were being set in motion that would turn her record attempt into something far more public and pressure-filled than anyone had initially planned. The quiet gun shop owner who'd never fired a shot was about to become the center of international attention. Whether she was ready for it or not, the first sign that something had changed came when Rebecca arrived at her gun shop the next morning to find a news van parked outside. A reporter and cameraman were waiting by her door, along with 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as representatives from major firearms manufacturers. Miss Torres, is it true you're attempting to break the world record for longest confirmed shot? The reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward her face before she could even unlock her door. Rebecca stared at them, bewildered. How did you... sources? Within the shooting community, one of the suit-wearing men interrupted smoothly. Miss Torres, I'm James Mitchell from Precision Arms Corporation. We'd like to discuss a potential sponsorship deal. The other man stepped forward. Robert Chun, Advanced Optics Systems. We'd be honored to provide equipment for your record attempt. Rebecca fumbled with her keys, her hands suddenly unsteady. She'd signed Harrison's contract less than 24 hours ago, and somehow the entire shooting world already knew about it. I'm sorry, but I need to. She managed to get her door open and slipped inside, closing it firmly behind her. Through the window, she could see the group discussing something animatedly. The reporter pointing at her shop while talking on his phone. Her own phone rang almost immediately. It was David. Rebecca, we have a problem, he said without preamble. Someone leaked the story. It's all over the shooting forums, and the major firearms publications are picking it up. Unknown gun shop owner attempts impossible world record is trending on social media. Rebecca sank into her father's old chair behind the counter. How is this possible? Harrison said it would be a small, private verification. Harrison's as surprised as we are. Apparently, someone at the ILRSA has connections to the shooting media, and they saw this as a major story. A complete unknown challenging a record that stood for years? Through her window, Rebecca watched more vehicles arrive. Another news van, several cars with out-of-state plates, and what appeared to be a small crowd of curious onlookers beginning to gather. David, I can't handle this. I'm not ready for media attention. I just wanted to see if I could make the shot. I know, but it's too late to back out now. The contract you signed includes media obligations if the story becomes public. And Rebecca ... His voice carried a warning. There are people who aren't happy about this. What do you mean? Check your email. Then call me back. Rebecca opened a laptop and immediately wished she hadn't. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, but many hostile. Professional shooters questioning her qualifications. Military veterans expressing outrage that a civilian amateur was attempting to break a record set by trained snipers. Forum posts dissecting every aspect of her background, with some users claiming she was a fraud. One email stood out from the others, sent from an address she didn't recognize, but with a subject line that made her blood run cold. You don't belong. Here, Miss Torres, the message read. Shooting at this level isn't a game for weekend hobbyists looking for fame. You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting everyone who's dedicated their lives to this discipline. Real shooters know their limits. Smart ones recognize when they're out of their league. Consider this friendly advice to withdraw before you make a fool of yourself publicly. It was unsigned, but the tone suggested it came from someone within the competitive shooting community. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she closed the laptop. The quiet confidence she'd built over 2 months of steady progress was cracking under the weight of sudden scrutiny. She'd gone from anonymous gun shop owner to lightning rod for controversy. In less than a day, the bell chimed, and Rebecca looked up to see a woman in her 50s entering the shop, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Miss Torres, I'm Janet Stevens, sports psychologist. Colonel Harrison sent me. She glanced toward the window where the crowd was growing. Looks like we need to talk. Janet closed the blinds and turned to face Rebecca with a direct gaze that seemed to see everything. How are you handling all this? I'm not, Rebecca admitted. Yesterday, I was worried about making a difficult shot. Today, I'm apparently public enemy number 1 in the shooting world. That's exactly what I expected to hear, Janet said, settling into a chair across from the counter. Rebecca, what you're experiencing is the downside of attempting something extraordinary. The shooting community is insular, traditional, and protective of its heroes. To them, you represent everything they fear. An outsider with no credentials threatening to make their lifetime achievements look ordinary. Maybe they're... Right, maybe I am in over my head. Are you? Janet's question was sharp, cutting through Rebecca's self-doubt. Have your abilities changed since yesterday? Has your understanding of ballistics suddenly disappeared? Can you no longer make the shots you were making last week? No, but then nothing has changed except other people's opinions. The question is whether you're going to let their fear control your actions. Janet pulled out a tablet and showed Rebecca a video. It was footage from her session at Harrison's facility, showing her 3-1000-5-100-20-yard shot in slow motion. This is what they're afraid of, Janet said. Not that you'll fail, that you'll succeed. Because if a gun shop owner with 2 months of training can break a record that elite shooters have chased for decades, what does that say about this? Methods, their assumptions, their entire approach to the discipline. Rebecca watched herself on the screen, noting the calm precision of her movements, the methodical way she approached each variable. The woman in the video looked confident, capable, entirely focused on the task at hand. You're not the same person who walked into that range 2 months ago, Janet continued. You've discovered something extraordinary about yourself. Don't let fear yours or theirs take that away. Rebecca's phone rang again. This time, it was Colonel Harrison. Rebecca, I owe you an apology. The media attention wasn't supposed to happen this way. But I need you to know we're still moving forward. The ILRSA has confirmed the attempt for 5 weeks from today, and we're implementing additional security measures to ensure proper conditions. Colonel, I'm getting hate mail. People are saying I don't belong, that I'm disrespecting the shooting community. Good, Harrison said firmly. That means you're threatening the status quo. The best shooters in history face similar criticism. Your father dealt with it when he developed new ballistic calculation methods. Innovation always creates resistance. What if they're right? What if I am just a lucky amateur? Rebecca, I've watched you shoot in conditions that would break most professionals. I've seen you solve ballistic problems that stump seasoned experts. You're not lucky, you're gifted. And gifts like yours don't come along often. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in silence while Janet observed her. Outside, she could hear the growing buzz of conversation as more people arrived. What do you want to do? Janet asked finally. Rebecca looked around her father's shop, at the tools he'd arranged with such precision, at the rifles that represented decades of his expertise, at the business he'd built through dedication and skill. She thought about the criticism he'd faced when developing new methods, about how he'd persevered despite resistance from traditional shooters. I want to prove them wrong, she said quietly. Janet smiled. Then let's get to work. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a moonscape of sand and scrub brush broken only by the Precision Shooting Institute's modern facilities. Rebecca had arrived 3 days early to acclimate to the conditions, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing at the firing line with 3,800 meters of empty desert between her and a target she could barely see even through high-powered optics. The morning of the attempt dawned clear and cold, with winds that would build throughout the day. Rebecca had been awake since 4 in the morning, studying weather reports and making final calculations. The target, a steel plate measuring 40 inches by 40 inches, sat on a distant ridge like a postage stamp against the horizon dot at this distance. Even with her scope's maximum magnification, it appeared as little more than a dark speck. Conditions are as good as we're going to get, David said, checking his weather instruments for the dozenth time. Wind is steady at 8 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature is 47 degrees and rising slowly. Humidity is minimal. Rebecca nodded, but her attention was focused on the crowd that had gathered to witness the attempt. Word had spread through the shooting community, and what was supposed to be a small official verification had become something approaching a spectacle. Military officials, ballistics experts, journalists, and curious shooters filled the observation area. She could feel their skepticism like a physical weight, some openly hostile, others merely curious about whether the amateur would embarrass herself publicly. A group of professional long-range shooters had arrived the day before, led by Thomas Brennan, a former Army Ranger who held several precision shooting records. They'd made no effort to hide their displeasure at being overshadowed by what they considered a publicity stunt. This is exactly what's wrong with the sport, she'd overheard Brennan saying to a reporter. Authentic skill gets ignored while media darlings get attention they haven't earned. Real precision shooting takes years to master, not months. Colonel Harrison approached with the official observers, 3 representatives from the International Long Range Shooting Association who would verify any successful shot. Miss Torres, are you ready to begin? Rebecca looked down at her rifle, the same custom .338 Lapua Magnum that David had brought to her shop 4 months ago. They'd made minor adjustments, a custom stock fitted to her dimensions, a trigger tuned to her exact preferences, but it was essentially the same weapon she'd been training with. Familiar, reliable, precise. I'm ready. The first shot was a disaster. Despite all her calculations, despite months of preparation, the bullet struck the hillside 20 feet left of the target. A collective murmur rose from the crowd, not surprise, but confirmation of what many had expected. Rebecca felt the weight of their judgment, the whispered conversations about the gun shop owner who thought she could break a world record after 4 months of shooting. Wind shift, David said quietly, studying his instruments. "The thermal currents are stronger than predicted." The bullet got caught in the crosswind about halfway to the target. Rebecca nodded, but she was already recalculating. The miss had provided valuable data about the actual conditions versus her theoretical projections. She made adjustments to her scope, factoring in the new wind information, then settled back into position. Her second shot was closer, much closer. The bullet struck the target frame, missing the scoring area by inches. The crowd's murmur changed tone, shifting from skepticism to interest. Rebecca had just demonstrated that she could hit a target the size of a small building at nearly 2.5 miles. For most shooters, that would have been the achievement of a lifetime. But Rebecca wasn't most shooters. Behind her, she could hear Thomas Brennan's voice carrying over the crowd. "Lucky adjustment. Watch her fall apart on the pressure shot." Rebecca closed her eyes and remembered something her father had told her years ago, a fragment of memory that had surfaced during her months of training. "Sometimes, sweetheart, you have to stop thinking and just trust your hands." She'd been overthinking the shots, trying to calculate every variable instead of trusting the instinct she'd developed through thousands of rounds of practice. The wind, the temperature, the atmospheric pressure, all of that mattered. But at some point, shooting became less about mathematics and more about feel. "One shot left," Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet observation area. Rebecca opened her eyes and settled into her final shooting position. Through the scope, the target seemed impossibly small and impossibly far away. She could feel her heartbeat, steady and strong. She could feel the rifle's weight, perfectly balanced and familiar. She could feel the wind on her face, carrying information about air currents and thermal patterns. She took a breath, let half of it out, and held. The crosshairs settled on the center of the distant target. For a moment, everything was perfectly still: her body, her breathing, her mind. The desert, the crowd, the pressure of the moment all faded away until there was nothing but the rifle, the target, and the space between them. Rebecca squeezed the trigger. The bullet's flight time was 6.8 seconds, an eternity in shooting terms. Rebecca watched through her scope as the tiny projectile arced across the desert. Riding air currents, she'd learned to read like a second language. The crowd was completely silent, everyone straining to see the distant target through binoculars and spotting scopes. The impact was visible even at that distance, a small puff of dust and the unmistakable ring of metal on metal that carried across the desert like a bell. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the official observer's radio crackled. To life. Target hit. Dead center. Confirmed impact at 3,847 meters. The silence exploded into chaos. Cheers, applause, and the rapid-fire clicking of cameras filled the air. Rebecca sat behind her rifle, stunned by what she'd just accomplished. She'd broken the world record for longest confirmed precision shot, extending it by nearly 100 meters. Thomas Brennan stood in the crowd, his expression unreadable as he processed what had just happened. The woman he'd dismissed as an amateur had just made a shot that he'd been attempting unsuccessfully for 3 years. But the real shock came later, when video analysis revealed something extraordinary. Rebecca's shooting technique was unlike anything the experts had seen, a hybrid style that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about long-range marksmanship. Her breathing pattern, her trigger control, her approach to reading wind conditions, all represented innovations that would be studied and copied by shooters around the world. Within hours of her record-breaking shot, Rebecca's phone was ringing, with offers from military contractors, shooting equipment manufacturers, and training facilities. Everyone wanted to understand how a woman who'd never fired a shot 4 months earlier had just redefined the limits of human precision. The calls came in a blur. Documentary producers, Book publishers, speaking bureaus, and corporate sponsors all eager to capitalize on her achievement. Rebecca found herself overwhelmed by the sudden transformation from anonymous gun shop owner to international shooting celebrity. "This is insane," she said to David as they sat in her hotel room, surrounded by contracts and business proposals. "6 months ago, my biggest concern was keeping enough gun oil in stock. Now I'm apparently worth millions in endorsement deals." David sorted through the offers with the methodical precision he brought to everything. The firearms industry sees you as a marketing goldmine. Ordinary woman achieves extraordinary results. It's the perfect story to sell products and training programs. Rebecca picked up one of the contracts, skimming through pages of legal language that promised substantial compensation for using her name and image. The numbers were staggering more money than her gun shop made in several years. "What do you think I should do?" "That depends on what you want," David replied. "Do you want to become a professional shooter? Travel the world making exhibition shots and endorsing products? Or do you want to go back to being Rebecca Torres, gun shop owner?" Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Colonel Harrison entered, his expression serious. "Rebecca, we need to talk about your future. The military is interested in your techniques. They want to study your methods, potentially incorporate them into sniper training programs." He sat down across from her, his tone shifting to something more formal. "But there's something else. The International Long-Range Shooting Association is facing pressure to investigate your record attempt. Some influential members are claiming it was a fluke, that proper protocols weren't followed." Rebecca felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Are they trying to invalidate the record? They're demanding a second verification attempt. Different location, different conditions, multiple shots instead of just one. They want to prove that what happened yesterday was luck, not skill. David leaned forward. And if she refuses, then doubts about the legitimacy of her achievement will follow her forever. But if she accepts and fails, double quotes, Harrison shrugged. Well, that would probably end her shooting career before it really begins. Rebecca stared out the window at the Nevada desert, where she'd made history less than 24 hours earlier. The record-breaking shot already felt like something that had happened to someone else. A moment of perfect clarity in what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. Who's behind this? She asked. Thomas Brennan and several other professional shooters. They're claiming that proper military-style verification requires multiple successful shots under varying conditions. They say anyone can get lucky once. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca. The same people who'd criticized her for attempting the record were now trying to force her to prove herself again under even more difficult circumstances. What would a second verification involve? Harrison pulled out a folder. 5 shots at 3,800 meters over 2 days, different times and wind conditions for each attempt. Minimum 3 hits required for official recognition. If you miss more than 2 shots, your original record is invalidated. Rebecca did the mathematics automatically. A 60% success rate at an extreme distance under varying conditions. It was far more challenging than her original single-shot record. This isn't about verification, David said angrily. This is about humiliation. They want to see her fail publicly. Maybe, Harrison agreed, but it's also an opportunity. If Rebecca can meet this challenge, it would establish her as the most skilled precision shooter in history, not just the luckiest. Rebecca thought about her father, about the resistance he'd faced when developing new ballistic calculation methods. He'd been forced to prove his innovations repeatedly, defending them against skeptics who preferred traditional approaches. When would this second verification take place? 6 weeks from now, assuming you accept. Same location, but extended over 2 days to ensure varying atmospheric conditions. Rebecca looked at the endorsement contracts scattered across the table, then at David and Harrison. The easy path would be to take the money and endorsement deals, building a career on her single record-breaking shot. But that would always leave questions about whether she'd simply been lucky. "I need to ask you something honestly," she said to Harrison. "Do you think I can do it? 5 shots at maximum distance under varying conditions?" Harrison's answer came, without hesitation. "I think you're the most naturally gifted shooter I've ever encountered. But this challenge is designed to be nearly impossible. Even military snipers with decades of experience would struggle with these parameters. And if I fail, then you fail attempting something extraordinary. But if you succeed—" He paused, studying her face. "If you succeed, you'll have proven something that changes how we think about human potential in precision shooting." Rebecca stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert that had witnessed her impossible achievement. In the distance, she could see the ridge where the target had been placed, a dot of metal that had become the focal point of her entire life. She thought about her gun shop, sitting empty while she pursued this dream. She thought about the quiet, predictable life she'd built after her father's death, and about the moment David had first challenged her to try shooting. Every decision since then had led to this choice, between accepting her achievement as it stood or risking everything to prove it wasn't a fluke. "I'll do it," she said finally, "but on one condition." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "Win or lose, after this second verification, I go back to my life. No more challenges, no more publicity stunts. I'll honor whatever endorsement. Commitments I make, but I return to running my father's gun shop." Harrison nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But Rebecca, you should know if you succeed in this challenge, going back to ordinary life might be more difficult than you think." 6 weeks later, Rebecca returned to the Nevada desert for what the shooting world was calling the ultimate verification. Media coverage had intensified, with major news networks covering the story of the gun shop owner defending her record against skeptical professionals. The conditions for the second verification were brutal. 5 shots over 2 days, with atmospheric conditions ranging from dead calm to gusty winds. Each shot would be taken at a different time of day to ensure varying light and temperature conditions. Thomas Brennan and his supporters watched from the observation area, confident that they were about to witness the exposure of an amateur who'd gotten lucky once. But Rebecca had spent the 6 weeks preparing differently than before. Instead of obsessing over ballistic calculations, she'd worked with Janet Stevens on mental preparation and confidence building. She'd learned to trust her instincts while maintaining her analytical approach. On the first day, under perfect morning conditions, her first shot struck dead center. The second shot, taken during the heat of midday with significant thermal disturbance, hit the target's edge, officially scored as a hit, but barely. The third shot, taken in late afternoon wind, missed by 3 feet. That night, Rebecca lay awake, knowing she needed 2 perfect shots the next day to succeed. A single miss would invalidate not just this challenge, but her original record as well. The fourth shot, taken at dawn under tricky crosswinds, required every bit of skill she'd developed. Rebecca spent 45 minutes reading the wind patterns before finally settling into position. When the bullet struck the target's center rim, the crowd erupted in surprised cheers. For her final shot, taken under the worst conditions, late afternoon thermal currents with gusting winds, Rebecca approached the firing line, knowing that this single bullet would define her legacy. She thought about her father's voice. Sometimes you have to stop thinking and just trust your hands. Rebecca took her position, made her calculations, then set them aside and trusted the instincts she'd developed through months of obsessive practice. The final shot struck the target dead center. The ultimate verification was complete. Rebecca had hit 4 of 5 shots at maximum distance under varying conditions, a success rate that established her not just as a record holder, but as the most accurate precision shooter in documented history. But true to her word, Rebecca declined the flood of new offers that followed. She returned to her father's gun shop, but with a difference. She transformed the back room into a classroom and the adjacent property into a precision shooting range. David became her business partner, and together they developed a training program that combined traditional marksmanship with Rebecca's intuitive understanding of ballistics and atmospheric conditions. Students came from around the world to learn from the woman who'd proven that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come from the most unexpected places. Rebecca taught them about wind reading and ballistic calculations, but more importantly, she taught them about the patience and precision her father had instilled in her, the same qualities that had turned a gun shop owner into the most accurate long-range shooter in recorded history. The rifle that had made the record-breaking shots hung on the wall behind her desk, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the simplest challenge. I dare you to try. Years later, when asked about her remarkable achievement, Rebecca would always return to the same truth her father had taught her: that precision isn't about perfection, but about the patient pursuit of it. And sometimes, when you combine natural ability with proper training and unwavering determination, the impossible becomes inevitable. The quiet gun shop owner had become a legend, but more importantly, she discovered exactly who she was meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.